My name is Adam Jacobs, Shavua Tov. I run the Aish Center in Manhattan, and I'm going to try to prove the existence of God in 5 ways in 45 minutes. So that's going to be an interesting challenge, but we'll see what we can do. So by way of very, very brief introduction for right this second, I went to Aish in Jerusalem for 5 years, came to New York. Eventually I got an interesting little side thing, writing for the Huffington Post. So I figured I was going to share Judaism with people, because that's what I like to do. It's my job. And I wrote my first article, was very excited about it, and I put it out there, and I was a little surprised to find people in the comment section completely making fun of it and disparaging it, because I'm used to, you come to forums like this, and I say stuff and you guys smile and you go along with it, and I wasn't accustomed to people just venomously yelling at me and challenging everything that I said online. I was so I was a little taken back by the whole thing, and I was wow, I thought I wrote this really nice article, and I can't believe people are yelling at me now. And so the next time I did it, I was a little cautious. I was I better be careful with what I write. And I was I researched a little more, and I was write it a little better. And still, same thing. And it was back in those days of the Huffington Post, I'm talking about you could get hundreds of people piling on you and making fun of you, and it was hard. And eventually, at a certain point, I just sort of started writing for this other audience, the skeptics. I just decided to talk to them, because they were the ones who were responding, and so I ended up thinking and learning more about it, and I ended up writing this article called "A Reasonable Argument for God's Existence." And as it happens, and this was my 15 seconds of fame. This article was shared about 8,000 times. There was 6,000 comments on it. And it was the 3rd most popular article on the Huffington Post for 3 days. So, all of a sudden I had arrived in talking about this topic. So that's how I got involved in writing about this. A little disclaimer is I am not a trained philosopher. I don't. If you have 2 PhDs from Oxford or something, and you want to challenge me, you're going to be able to. I'm a layman in terms of these matters. However, I am someone who has thought about them for the purpose of trying to convince people out in the world that this is something that should be taken seriously. And I do believe that the arguments that I'm going to present now in a total of 43 minutes are compelling and important, so that when people come and they say, Rabbi, I think it's great what you do, but those fairy tales that you believe in, and that thing in the sky, please. And I say oh really? So can you answer certain fundamental questions what is the origin of matter? What is the origin of life? What is the origin of consciousness? And they say what? You know that you can challenge people in a nice way, and truthfully, they don't really have answers. Right? A lot of people make a lot of assumptions about the nature of things. They have not thought so deeply about this, and they tend to go around with the crowd, and whatever is thought by most people is what they think. Okay, let's learn what these are, and you can share them with people and see what they have to say about it. But I felt, as I was writing for this website, that I was coming very late to a discussion that had been taking place for hundreds of years, is the truth. And I felt a little ignorant that I had not known about them in detail. And it took several years to bone up on the information and really come to understand it to the degree that I'm able to. But, all right, so the first one is called the Cosmological Argument for God's Existence. It's very complicated and very simple. So meaning the premise is simple. To really understand it takes time and effort, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in this line of thinking to go ahead and research it. But this argument was embraced by people of all different kinds of backgrounds. There was Christians, Jews, Muslims, and even pagans who thought about it, wrote about it, and shared it with people. And so Maimonides is the big one for us. He wrote about it in his Guide for the Perplexed. And it is, in that sense, it is a part of Jewish consciousness, even though its origins were not Jewish. And it works essentially like this. And there's going to be two different versions of this that I'm going to share tonight, and you let me know which one you think is better. Okay, it has three premises. Premise number one: everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Pretty simple, seemingly. Everything that begins to exist was caused. Premise number two: the universe began to exist, meaning the universe was not always here. Okay? Premise number three: the universe has a cause of its existence. That is the argument. Does it seem compelling? Well, there are entire books written about this on both sides. And let's look a little bit more carefully. I'm learning this from actually a Christian theologian, philosopher named William Lane Craig, who has a book called the Cosmological Argument. This version of it is called Kalam. It has origins in the Muslim world. So lest we think that the Muslims did not make philosophical contributions to humanity, they did. They had developed this idea from Aristotle. Was popularized by a Muslim thinker named Al-Ghazali. Rambam picked up on that, and so did Thomas Aquinas, who has the Christian version of it. So it's a very well accepted in the philosophical world argument for the existence of God. So Professor Craig, who was a brilliant man, spends about 8 pages dealing with the first premise, which is everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So 8 pages in a whole book doesn't seem like very much, right? Why? Because it just seems so obvious, right? So the example I like to use is like, imagine there was a raspberry Danish here, right? And I asked you, where did this raspberry Danish come from? It's very unlikely that anyone would say to me, maybe this particular raspberry Danish was uncaused. Maybe it just popped into existence, right? Nobody lives that way. Nobody thinks that way. Everybody thinks that everything that they see that begins to exist has a cause. Is that fair to say? Okay, so therefore, we don't really worry about that. However, premise number 2, which is the universe began to exist, is a little bit more complicated because, as we know, people did not always accept the fact that the universe began to exist. For many, many centuries, people assumed that the universe was always here, right? Which in some sense is a more logical conclusion, because where would it have come from? How did it come about? It's easier to say it was always here, okay? However, there's 2 reasons, 2 lines of thinking that demonstrate to us that the universe must have had a beginning. One of them is philosophical, and the other one is empirical. And I will tell you quickly both, and then we'll get off this argument, because 35 minutes. Okay, here's the philosophical reason why there must be an origin to the universe. It's got 3 premises itself. And again, you don't have to memorize each thing and hold it in your head. Just let it wash over you for now, and you can research it on your own. Premise number 1 for why the universe must have had an origin is that an actual infinite, meaning a physical infinite, cannot exist. A metaphysical infinite could exist, but a physical one there is no such thing in the world as a physical infinity. Premise 2, forgive the terminology, but an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite, which means, in simpler language, that time cannot go back forever, because that is an infinite series, an infinite amount of time, an infinite amount of anything. This says, does not exist. Why? because it is known as the problem of the infinite regress. This is a philosophical problem. Most philosophers agree that there is no such thing as an infinite regress, which in this case it means, that this is hard to wrap your head around for a second, but let's imagine here's time. Here's the past, here's the future. We're here, moving along. So if time had always been unfolding infinitely, that presupposes that an infinite amount of time has passed between then and now. But how could that be? Because we see that we're in the process of time unfolding now. Infinite time has not passed. It's finite. The time is unfolding now. And additionally, if time stretched infinitely in this direction, how did we ever arrive here? You'd have to be, it's infinitely in that direction, time. You could never have gotten here. It's impossible. That's called the infinite regress. One other way of thinking about that is there was a famous Native American tribe that believed that the universe rested on the back of a great turtle. Okay? So some wise guys came and wanted to ask philosophical questions of these folks, and they said, listen, that's great, but what is the turtle standing on if the world is standing on the back of a great turtle? And they said, on another turtle, right? And, okay, right, so a third turtle, a trillion turtle, like how many turtles do we have? You would have to have an infinite number of turtles, and then what's it standing on at the end? What's the last one? Otherwise it couldn't stand. Does that make sense? Okay, so therefore, it must be that there was a beginning of the universe that allowed us to reach this point in time. Okay, and that's the philosophical version. The empirical version goes like this. We know that there is something called entropy in the world. We know that the universe tends to move from a state of unity and order to a state of disunity and disorder. That's the nature of physics. This is just a physical phenomena, right? Not making it up. So, if the universe has always been here, what would we expect the universe to be like? Very ordered? Should we have stars and planets and systems? Or would we expect everything to just be lifeless, cold, uniform? Everything should have broken down already a long, long time ago, right? Sort of like if you imagine you left New York City alone for 10,000 years, you would expect everything to have crumbled at a certain point. It would all have broken down and become nothing, right? Which happens to rocks. It happens to everything. Everything moves towards a state of disorder. It's believed that in the distant future, the universe will reach something called heat death, which means that it will no longer support anything. It will be all frozen cold wasteland, and motionless. That everything will come to a stop, which is a very depressing thought. But be that as it may, by virtue of the fact that the universe has not reached this state, it means that the universe is not infinitely old. It must have started at a particular time. For those reasons, our initial three premises, which were everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, the universe has a cause of its existence. Then it becomes a question of explaining what is the cause exactly. What is the cause? And that's a second question, but it's we'll leave that for right now. That is how the Kalam cosmological argument works. Any one question before we move on to the second one? It's all very simple. Yes?
Why if we haven't gotten to the end point, it means that it hasn't been like a long time before that?
Because, well, we see if the universe has literally been here forever, for all time,
Why can't we be on continuing forever?
because it should have happened infinitely long ago. Infinitely long ago, because time has been unfolding for an infinite period of time.
Okay, so why are we on the spectrum of that?
The only way that we could be on the spectrum where it's starting to break down is if it started in the relatively recent past, and now it's unwinding. If it started infinitely long ago, that
Then it keeps sort of like,
right. Yes, eons ago. Okay, version number 2 of this is put forth by Thomas Aquinas. It's not called Kalam, it is called the Cosmological Argument for God's existence also, but it's a different version of it. Okay, follow this one. Whereas the Kalam cosmological argument deals with a horizontal, linear way of thinking about this, this version is a vertical one. And interestingly, it doesn't care whether the universe was here for an infinitely long time or not. It's not the way it works. It says that even if the universe had been here for an infinite period of time, it still must be that there is an ultimate force, an unmoved mover, as Aristotle called it, that brought everything into existence, maintains it, so on and so forth. There has to be a stopping point where you cannot go any farther. And let's see how this one works. Premise number 1 in this one is whatever begins to exist has a cause. Sound familiar? Okay. So, and by the way, it's always formulated by whatever begins to exist has a cause. Because if not, you could turn around and say, hey, well, what caused God? If everything has a cause, then God must have a cause too. Otherwise, you guys are being hypocrites, right? So we don't say that. We say everything that begins to exist has a cause, but God did not begin to exist, and so therefore is not part of this. Number 2, the universe began to exist. 3, the universe has a cause. So it restates the Kalam version of this, and then goes on to a different path, which works like this. Aquinas uses an analogy. So let's say you had a stick in your hand and you were pushing a stone. Is it fair to say that the stick is pushing the stone? Is the stick the thing that's doing the pushing of the stone? Or is the hand doing it? Yes? The hand. Okay. So it's sort of happening at the same time though, isn't it? The stick is doing it and the hand is doing it. So like it's all part of one thing that's happening simultaneously. Okay, but how is the hand capable of pushing something? What's that? It's attached to a body. Okay, fine. But in the arm, there's muscles, right? And in the muscles, there are cells. And in the cells, there's an atomic structure. And then beyond that, there are quarks. And then quarks and things are dependent on the 4 forces of nature, which everyone know what those are? Electromagnetism. And one more? That's right. Okay, so now, what we've just done is we've traced the action of pushing a stone with a stick is dependent on the 4 fundamental forces of nature to be able to work. Well, what is causing the 4 fundamental forces of nature? We could say we don't know, right? Or we can say it must be that it's some higher thing, right? Maybe there's another force that's beyond the 4 forces, and maybe there's another force that's beyond those forces. But here's the problem. If you don't arrive at a conclusion, something that gets the ball rolling, literally in this case, it can't roll. There has to be a backstop. There has to be a finish line. Something has to get the series going, even if it's an infinite series. So let's imagine a couple of things. You put mirrors next to each other, and they trail off into forever, and people standing in front of them, and it's cool, right? So let's say you had an infinite amount of mirrors, all reflecting off of each other, and there was an image in each mirror of a bear. Okay. It's an infinite series. Is it fair to say that there is no bear anywhere in that series? Or would you say, no, there must be one. There must be an actual bear somewhere. Which is it? Okay, good, all right, that makes sense. So even if there's an infinite number of mirrors, there has to be something that starts the whole series going. Otherwise, where the heck does this image come from? Okay. Example number 2. Let's say you're driving through the countryside, and you wait at a train crossing, and those country trains with 12,000 cars on them. You have to wait a really long time, right? and it's going and going, and like an hour goes by, 2 hours, and you're like, my gosh, this is the longest train I've ever seen. And then you realize this is an infinite series of train cars, flatbed train cars. It will go forever, okay? And they just go and go and go. So should we conclude that there is no source of locomotion, that there's no locomotive pulling it, just because it goes and goes and goes and there's seemingly an infinite series of them? Or must we conclude that at the end of the day, there must be one final source that is causing the entire thing to move? Which one is more logical? I think the answer is obvious, right? So too, according to Aquinas' version of the cosmological arguments, nothing can happen ever, not me waving my hand, not the air moving around in the room, not the heat, the cold, anything, unless instantaneously in this very moment it comes to rest vertically with an infinite, unmovable source of all that there is. If that doesn't exist, no motion is possible, no change is possible. Everything is contingent, everything is dependent on something that must be non-contingent, something that must not change. And that's how that argument works. Now, I just want to tell you quickly that there are some very fascinating corollaries to that argument, because in both versions of this argument, you could say, hey, that's all fine and good that you say that there's some infinite force out there that makes things go. Great, but who cares? Because who knows what the nature of that force is? Maybe it's just a force. It's some natural thing. Why do I have to say it's God? Like, that's pushing it. However, I'll just read it to you. So, inasmuch as there must be an ultimate non-contingent force, its non-contingency indicates that, as held in monotheism, it must be singular, for if there were more than one mover, each would be limited and hence contingent, deriving their power from some earlier source. So you can only have one of these, because if you have more than one, both are contingent, they're limited, and therefore they're not the unmoved mover. They're not the end point. So it must be singular, whatever the thing is, which is of course what monotheism suggests, that God, the mover, the unmoved mover, is one. That's the national anthem of Judaism. Okay. Such a force would also need to be immaterial, as material things are changeable and therefore contingent. So we're talking about a metaphysical force, not a physical one. This being would not come into or go out of existence, but simply would always exist, because it can't change. Finally, as the source of all change, this prime mover would be the ultimate cause of things coming to have the qualities that they do. Eminently, if not formally, which is a philosophical term, this being it causes all things to be, and therefore has all power. It's the source of all power. So it's all-powerful, all-knowing, unchanging, infinite, non-material being that causes everything and maintains everything. Doesn't that sound very much like what Jews would call Hashem? To me, it does. Okay, so yes.
Why can it be that this original force, like the locomotive pushing all the cars, cease to exist? In theory, I can get the ball rolling and then disappear. The ball will continue rolling on its own. Why does it have to be eternal?
Because that would make it contingent if it could go out of existence, and therefore it can't possibly, by our definition, be the unmoved mover, because that would make it dependent on something. It doesn't have the power to be the thing that we're describing. If anything changes or comes into or out of existence, it's limited. If it's limited, it was caused by something else. It got its power from some other thing. And that just takes us one step back. So you can say, okay, something must have caused this thing. So there, take it a step back. What caused that thing? Oh, what caused this thing? What caused this thing? And as we're going back in these causes, we end up in the problem of the infinite regress, which we outlined in the first argument, which is a philosophical impossibility, a philosophical and empirical impossibility. There is no such thing as an infinite regress of events or causes. And if the locomotive could go out of existence, which of course the locomotives obviously are not what we're talking about anyway, it's a dogma. It's a way of thinking about it. If this force was contingent or dependent on something in any manner, it's not the force we're talking about. And it takes us one step back and forces us to ask the question again. It takes a little bit of marinating in order to, it's hard to wrap your head around. It is. But what I suggest, if you find it interesting or compelling, there's lots and lots of articles and books written on it, and some of them really stretch your brain, right? But it's very satisfying because I find that when you come out the other side, you're like, yeah, that must be. And it's very exciting to me. Yeah?
I'm not sure this law supports what you're saying.
Okay.
Or disagrees with what you're saying.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it supports it.
Okay.
But infinity only exists in mathematics, a negative infinity as a definition.
Yes.
There is no, that we can't write like n plus 1 equals infinity.
Right. That's correct.
Just like infinity plus 1
Yep.
equals what, infinity again?
Yes. Both cases are infinity.
Both cases are going to be infinity.
Right.
So if something exists, it can't be infinity.
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, of course we say that God exists. He just exists in a totally different way than everything else exists. He's existence itself, right? As opposed to contingent things, physical things. Anything physical is contingent,
Right.
and therefore is not infinite.
That's right.
And despite the fact that there are philosophers like David Hume and mathematicians like Georg Cantor who talked about infinities, real infinities in the world, it's all very abstract and couldn't possibly be applied to real life. And if anyone finds that particular point interesting, I recommend the writing of Elizabeth Anscombe, who is a well-known philosopher who takes Hume to the woodshed over the idea that things can be uncaused. Nobody believes it. Nobody in their day-to-day existences believes that things just pop into existence. We just don't operate that way. And these infinities that you're talking about, mathematical infinities exist, but they exist only in the minds of people. They don't exist in real life. So you're supporting what I'm saying.
I'm supporting what you're saying.
Yes.
It's like, because we're like going from like the algebra to the calculus with the infinitesimally small increments.
Yes, right. That's a perfect example of how an infinity cannot exist in real life.
Right. And just the same way the calculus does exist, God exists.
Yeah, well, that's a different point and a deep point, actually. And I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about it. I was going to, but just in a nutshell, he's saying something very interesting, which is there are many mathematicians, accomplished Nobel Prize winning mathematicians, who stand in a kind of metaphysical awe of mathematics. And I'm not saying they're just nerds, and just love math. I'm saying that when they discover math, they're in shock because they feel that they're discovering a pre-existing world that literally exists, but not here. In other words, they believe that there's a mathematical realm where mathematics actually exists, separate from the universe. And the miracle in their way of thinking is, how is it possible that this theoretical mathematical world can be applied to this world and actually work? It's crazy. And if you think about it, there are mathematics that are discovered first and only decades later are applied to the physical world. I won't say the real world, the physical world, in a way that actually functions. If you think about it for a moment, that is impossible. That you cannot, and mathematicians feel that they are discovering the world, they're not creating it. In other words, the person, when Einstein came up with math, or all kinds of famous people, they come up with math. They're not inventing it as far as they're concerned, they're just revealing it, which means it was there already. But how could it have been there? It doesn't exist physically. Where is it? Where is that math? Where are the laws of nature while we're at it? Who says that the laws of nature, where is it written that gravitation should be at this rate and that light should travel at this speed? What governs the physical world and enables those formulas to act within the physical world. That actually is the next part of what I wanted to talk about. Okay. Argument number 3, it's called the teleological argument, also known as the argument from design. All of us are very familiar with this. It means basically like, look the heck around. Like, you think this just happened accidentally? And of course, since 1859, people have said, yeah, of course, it can be an accident. It's called evolution, right? Just happened, right? Whatever one holds about evolution, right? I believe that even you could believe 100% in evolution and still believe that it's completely impossible that it happened randomly, right? The randomness is really the problem as far as I'm concerned. But be that as that's a different topic. The question for us, and this is a question that even arch atheists, when they ask, who was it? They asked Sam Harris, I believe, and others, like, what is the one argument that the theists make, the believers, that gives you, makes you lose a night's sleep, right? And they say this one. It's called the anthropic principle, sometimes known as the cosmological constants. The question is, how is it that the laws of nature have the values that they have, and why are they so perfect? It's also sometimes known as the fine-tuning argument, fine-tuning of the universe. But it freaks people out when they look at it, because if these constants were any different ratios, life would just simply cease to exist. So let me quote you Richard Feynman, one of the greatest scientists of all time, one of the most brilliant minds ever, who was talking about a particular cosmological constant, a particular aspect of the physical world that has a particular ratio, and he's wondering about it. And he says the following. He says, immediately you would like to know where this number for a coupling comes from. He's talking about the coupling of molecules together. There's a ratio that governs how it's done. I forget what it's called. Is it related to pi, or perhaps the base of natural logarithms? Nobody knows. It's one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics. A magic number that comes to us with no understanding by man. You might say that the hand of God wrote that number, and we don't know how he pushed the pencil. This is a secular Nobel Prize winning scientist. And when these people are being honest, it is quite revealing where their minds go. They won't ever say it. They won't just come out and say it, like, seems to me that there's a God who's made everything, and but they dance around it, and they come close to saying it. And so here you have Richard Feynman is saying, I don't get it. Like, there's this rate of the universe. It's so perfect. It's so precise. If it was any different, we couldn't have life. How did it come to be this way? Or in other words, I think there's about 22 of these cosmological constants. One of them with the right ratio is like winning the Powerball, right? Just so unlikely, right? But let's say Jim Smith wins the New Jersey Powerball on Tuesday, right? No one cares that much, because they're happy for him. But let's say that the same guy wins it again the next week. Do you think that he cheated? Or is he just really lucky? What? By number 2, you say he cheated. Okay, but you know that there's a mathematical possibility that he could win 2 weeks in a row, yeah? It's less likely than flipping a coin for 3 straight months every second and getting heads every single time. But it could happen. But now let's say the guy comes back and wins it again 3 weeks in a row. Do you think that the New Jersey Powerball would issue this guy another lottery ticket at that point? Everyone knows. The truth is, by number 2, we already suspect strongly there's been some cheating. By 3, everyone says, no, that was arranged. You can't do that, right? So what would you say if the guy won it 22 different times? Straight. And he says to the commission, listen, you know that there's a mathematical probability. It's not very likely, but I certainly could win it, that many times. It's just very unlikely, and probably will never happen again. But I was all straight and up and up. No one buys it. When you hit the lottery that many times in a row, you know that it was by design. And this argument is about design. Okay, so here It's just one more example of it. How are we doing? Okay. Here's very interesting. Stars. Stars produce energy by fusing 2 hydrogen atoms into a single helium atom. And if it wasn't for that process, none of us would be here. So it's lucky. So during the reaction, 0.007% of the mass of the hydrogen atoms is converted into energy. Got it? 0.007%. That must happen for stars to work. If it doesn't happen, they don't work. Here's how precise it is. Okay, if the percentage were 0.006, the universe would be filled with only hydrogen. That's it. If it was 0.008, the universe would have no hydrogen, and therefore no water and no stars and no sun. Which means it was threaded perfectly. 0.007 is what this number must be for stars to exist the way that we need them to exist. One little micron this way, you have a universe that's only hydrogen, and 1 micron this way, and you have no hydrogen whatsoever, and therefore nothing that we care about. How is it so perfect? That's the question, right? So there are scenarios that are offered for how you can get around that, right? Anyone know the most famous?
Multiple universe?
Yes, right. So the multiverse was a theory that is put forth, in my opinion, out of desperation, which suggests maybe the universe is just one of an infinite number of universes, and they're all different, right? And so therefore, our particular universe just happens to have those properties, but there's an infinite number of them that don't. So yeah, of course, we're lucky to inhabit the one that does, but that's not so unlikely. If you have an infinite number of tries, you'll get it, right? So there are some philosophical and scientific problems with the theory, which I'll just point out quickly. One, it's actually not a scientific theory because it can't be tested. There's no way of testing for another universe outside of ours. And so therefore, it's a philosophical argument that has to be left where it is. You can't prove it either way. It's just someone's idea. And so therefore, for people who like to advance it, we're having an argument about physics, real physics, and you're telling me a philosophical argument that can't be tested anyway. So like, that's weak as far as I'm concerned. Two is its incoherence. Why? Because if there's an infinite number of universes with an infinite number of properties, it means that in one of the universes, there is an infinite God who caused the entire multiverse to exist, and in another universe, there's not. Can't have it both ways, guys, right? So like, which is it? That's a problem. And also, it doesn't fulfill the what's known as the Occam's razor. William of Occam famously said that you always pick the most elegant and simplest argument when you're trying to evaluate the truth of a claim. This is not the simplest argument. This is very complicated. It's actually dramatically more simple to assert that there's an infinite being that some people choose to call God that brought the universe into existence, and to say there's this crazy like multiverse thing that we can't test anyway. So that is the teleological argument. There's much, much, much more to be said about each one of these, but I won't. 7 minutes. Okay. How's everyone? Are you holding your brains okay? Okay. Second to last, 6 arguments for the existence of the non-physical. We mentioned mathematics. Mathematics is not a physical thing, yet we believe it exists, right? The idea behind this argument is that once you can demonstrate that there are non-physical things, it's not that far of a leap to go to a all-powerful non-physical being that some people choose to call God, right? And this argument I found actually bothers atheists because they have no choice but to admit that it's true. And But then they'd say like, well, you're jumping to a conclusion, blah, 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 blah. But once you get them to believe that there's some non-physical things that actually exist, we're in a different ballpark, because most atheism and what I call scientism, which is sort of like a worship of science. I think science is incredible and is revolutionized the world, unbelievably valuable. But I also believe that people get unduly caught up with it. And believe that it can answer all questions and solve all problems, which I do not believe is the case. And so here we're going to show that it must be that there is a non-physical reality. Okay, ready? Number one, and I apologize in advance because none of these are simple. So just listen. Okay, this is called the one over many argument. While there may be very many examples of triangles, such as scalene, obtuse, and isosceles, and many shades of blue, such as cobalt, turquoise, and ultramarine, triangularity and blueness are not reducible to any particular triangle or blue thing. What this ultimately is going to get at is that blueness and triangularity don't exist in the world. They could be manifested. You can try to have a triangle, right? You can try to have blue. But what would happen if all knowledge of blueness went out of existence in the universe and there was no example of it? Would it still be real? The answer would be yes. What's that? But let's say there was no human mind capable of perceiving that there was blueness, and there was no example of blueness in existence at that particular moment. Would blueness still be a real thing?
Yes.
And the answer is yes. Yeah, you could. Yeah. What's that? Blueness happens to be here right now. But in theory, it doesn't have to be, and yet it could still be true. But the trueness would not exist in the physical sense. It would exist in an abstract, non-physical sense that could become physical. Understand? Thereby proving the existence of something that's not physical. Again, I apologize. This could be an hour by itself, just this one. So you're just gonna let it wash in there for a second. I won't even do all of them. The argument from mathematics is one of them. We already covered that. The argument from abstract objects. Plato was very into this whole thing, by the way. Platonic forms is part of this. So geometry deals with perfect lines, angles, circles, etc., and discovers objective facts about them. As the facts are objective, we haven't invented them and they could not be altered, like material things. Clearly then, they do not depend on our minds. Also, no physical objects have the perfection that geometrical ones do, so clearly they are not dependent on the physical material world. When you draw a straight line, it is not actually straight. No matter how precise, not with a laser printer, not with the most fancy scientific machine, you cannot draw an actual straight line. If you looked at it very, very, very closely, it would be a little bit wavy. And so therefore, the idea of a straight line does not exist in the physical world. Neither does a circle, neither does a square. There is an abstract notion of it that exists somewhere out there, but it is not a physical thing. It cannot be manifested in the physical world. Okay, this is one called an argument from the nature of, I'm going to stop after this one. The argument from the nature of propositions. A proposition like, I hope people understand this one, Kurt Cobain is a member of the 27 Club. Without explaining what that means, it's a proposition, it's an idea. So that would remain true even if the entire world and all minds in it suddenly went out of existence. Interestingly, even if no mind or material world ever existed, the proposition, there is no material world nor human mind, would still be true, proving that it is neither material nor mental. This is a very strange one. But basically it says that these ideas are so not dependent on the physical world that even the notion, quote, there is no physical world, still is true even if there's no physical world. And therefore the truth of the statement exists up there somewhere and not manifested in reality. There's other ones, but I just want to end with one that I particularly like. This is number 5. This is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument took place in many, many forms over many, many centuries. You could have an entire college course just on this, on each one of these, actually. But what I like to point out is one that was done by the most famous logician of all time. His name's Kurt Girdle, or Gödel, if you prefer. This is a picture of him. Genius, super utter genius. Considered, he thought his job was to think. He created formulas about mathematics and about logic and all kinds of interesting things. He was considered one of the greatest thinkers of all time. Well, while he was at Princeton in a semi-retired state, he decided to write his own ontological argument, which is meaning a proof of God, right? And he said he was embarrassed. He wouldn't, of course, said like, I really believe in God and I want to prove God's existence. He just said, oh, that was just a little pastime I did while I was, I just thought it'd be a fun exercise. Not that I really believe it, of course not, But so I like to point, when people say to me online or otherwise, Rabbi, there's no God, there's no God, and I say, well, okay, here's Kurt Gödel's ontological formula. This is his proof of the existence of God. See it? Very straightforward, as you can see. Honestly, I put this in here, I have no idea what it means. I don't have the foggiest idea what it's talking about. Nothing, right? It's a bunch of mathematics or symbols. I don't know what it means. But my point is, you can't go around saying there's no God when you have one of the smartest people in the world who put forward a mathematical formula that says, yes, there is. Right? Maybe we should be a little humble, take a step back and be like, well, if this guy could put it out there, maybe I should just wait a second before drawing a conclusion, because sometimes I feel like the entire philosophical analysis that people do is like on the back of a bus one day, they say to themselves like, is there a God? No, there's no God, right? And that's the end of it. Meanwhile, there are many, many reasons to think there is, and I would encourage people, A, if you find this interesting and valuable, look into it, and B, teach people about it, because there's a heck of a lot of people out there who don't know about it, who deserve to and should. And I thank you for listening tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.